the gaslit corridors of Pennsylvania Hospital, desperate mothers whispered prayers that would never be answered. The year was 1841, and behind the sterile walls of America's first lying-in ward, two women in white aprons were building an empire of death, one newborn at a time. Philadelphia, 1841. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant cry of street vendors hawking their wares. But within the imposing brick walls of Pennsylvania Hospital, a different kind of sound pierced the autumn air. The agonized screams of women in labor, followed too often by an eerie, suffocating silence. The hospital's lying-in department had stood as a beacon of hope since 1803, the first official maternity ward in America. It was here that the desperate and destitute came seeking salvation, clutching their swollen bellies and praying for safe passage into motherhood. What they found instead was a chamber of horrors disguised as medical progress. Martha Blackwood adjusted her pristine white apron and smiled at the young woman writhing on the straw-stuffed mattress. At 38, Martha had delivered more babies than she could count, her hands steady and sure despite the dark secrets they harbored. Beside her, Eleanor Hartwell, barely 25 but already hardened by years of unspeakable acts, prepared the instruments with practiced efficiency. The patient, barely 17 and unmarried, had arrived at the hospital's doors 3 days prior. Sarah Miller was her name, though it would soon be forgotten among the growing list of the disappeared. She had walked the 50 miles from her family's farm, cast out by her father and carrying nothing but shame and the child growing within her. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Please help me." Martha's smile never wavered as she leaned closer, her breath smelling of laudanum and something else, something rotten. "Of course, dear child. We're here to help. That's what we do." But help was the furthest thing from Martha's mind. She had built her reputation on discretion and results, though the results were not what her patients expected. The unmarried mothers, the desperate wives, the women who came seeking refuge, they all paid the same price. Some paid with their coins, others with their lives, and many paid with both. Eleanor moved to the window, checking the street below. The autumn of 1841 had been particularly profitable. Word had spread through the immigrant communities and working-class neighborhoods that Pennsylvania Hospital's lying-in department offered services that no respectable physician would provide. Women came seeking abortions, adoptions, and solutions to pregnancies that threatened their very survival in a society that showed no mercy to fallen women. What they didn't know was that Martha and Eleanor had transformed the sterile medical facility into something far more sinister, a systematic operation that preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The hospital administration, focused on their paying patients in other wards, rarely questioned the activities in the maternity department, especially when the charitable donations from grateful families continued to flow. As Sarah's contractions intensified, Martha prepared her tools. Tonight, another problem would be solved, another secret would be buried, and another entry would be made in the ledger that Eleanor kept hidden beneath the floorboards. Tell me in the comments, if you discovered this was happening in your neighborhood, would you have had the courage to speak up? Martha Blackwood had not always been a killer. Born in the Pennsylvania countryside in 1803, she had entered the world just as the hospital's lying-in department opened its doors for the first time. The symmetry was not lost on those who would later piece together her story, as if fate had marked her from birth to be intertwined with the institution that would become her hunting ground. Her path to midwifery began innocently enough. After losing her own child in infancy and discovering she could bear no more, Martha threw herself into helping other women bring life into the world. She apprenticed under Dr. Thomas Chalky James, one of the first physicians designated specifically for the lying-in department. James, a respected member of Philadelphia's medical community, saw promise in the young woman's steady hands and unflappable demeanor during even the most difficult births. What James didn't see was the darkness that had taken root in Martha's heart after her personal tragedy. The death of her infant son had shattered something fundamental within her, replacing maternal instinct with a cold calculation that would serve her well in the years to come. Eleanor Hartwell's journey was different but no less tragic. The daughter of a seamstress and an unknown father, she had grown up in the tenements of Philadelphia's Northern Liberties District, where survival depended on wit and the willingness to do whatever necessary to see another dawn. At 15, she had found herself pregnant and alone, eventually making her way to Pennsylvania Hospital's charity ward. It was there that she first encountered Martha Blackwood, who delivered Eleanor's stillborn daughter with a detachment that both horrified and fascinated the young woman. Instead of offering comfort, Martha had simply stated, "Perhaps it's for the best. Another mouth to feed in your circumstances would have been a burden." Those words, spoken with clinical precision, planted a seed in Eleanor's mind. When Martha offered her a position as an assistant in the lying-in ward, Eleanor accepted without hesitation. She had learned that sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, and Martha Blackwood offered something more valuable than sympathy. She offered opportunity. By 1841, the two women had been working together for 3 years, their partnership evolving from professional collaboration into something far more sinister. Martha provided the medical expertise and connections within the hospital hierarchy, while Eleanor handled the more delicate aspects of their expanding enterprise, the negotiations with desperate families, the disposal of evidence, and the careful maintenance of their public reputation as Philadelphia's most discreet midwives. Their clientele had grown beyond the hospital's charity cases. Wealthy merchants' daughters who had made unfortunate choices, politicians' wives seeking to terminate unwanted pregnancies, and immigrant women who paid in advance for services they would never live to receive, all found their way to the 3rd floor of Pennsylvania Hospital, where Martha and Eleanor waited with their instruments and their smiles. The autumn of 1841 would mark the beginning of their most prolific period, as economic hardship drove more desperate women to their door. Would you have trusted these women with your life based on their reputation alone? The ledger that Eleanor kept hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the supply room told a story that would have horrified even the most hardened observer. Written in her precise script, it recorded not just births and deaths, but profits and losses in a business that treated human life as a commodity to be bought, sold, and disposed of at will. October 15, 1841. S. Miller, age 17, from Bucks County. Payment, $12 in advance, gold locket, wedding ring, brass. Procedure, full-term delivery with complications. Outcome, mother deceased, infant deceased. Burial fee, $3. Profit, $9. But the ledger told only part of the story. What it couldn't capture was the systematic cruelty that Martha and Eleanor had perfected. Over their years of collaboration, they had identified the perfect victims, women with no family connections in the city, no one to ask questions if they simply disappeared. Unmarried mothers were ideal, as were recent immigrants who spoke little English and had few resources to investigate when their daughters failed to return home. The two women had developed a sophisticated network throughout Philadelphia's poorest neighborhoods. Eleanor would frequent the taverns and boarding houses where desperate women gathered, posing as a concerned citizen offering help. She spoke of a discreet hospital ward where problems could be solved quietly, where no judgment would be passed, and where even the most complicated situations could be resolved for a reasonable fee. Martha's role was more subtle but equally crucial. Her position within the hospital gave their operation legitimacy and protected them from scrutiny. When the occasional question arose about the high mortality rate in the lying-in ward, Martha would cite the dangerous nature of childbirth and the poor health of their charitable cases. Her medical credentials and apparent dedication to serving the poor made her explanations unquestionable. Their methods varied depending on the situation and the payment received. Wealthy clients seeking abortions were generally safe. Their procedures were performed with care, and their silence was ensured through both professional discretion and mutual interest in keeping the matter private. These clients provided the steady income that funded the operation and maintained their reputation among Philadelphia's elite. The poor, however, faced a different fate. Those who could only afford minimal payment often found themselves victims of deliberate malpractice. Martha would introduce complications during delivery, using unsterilized instruments or applying excessive force during difficult births. Eleanor would administer dangerous doses of laudanum or other substances that suppressed breathing. and heart function. The most profitable cases were those where the client paid in advance for both delivery and adoption services. These women would arrive expecting to give birth and surrender their children to loving families, only to find themselves victims of a carefully orchestrated murder scheme. Both mother and child would die during complications, allowing Martha and Eleanor to keep the full payment while disposing of two potential witnesses to their activities. By November of 1841, their operation was generating more income than many legitimate businesses in Philadelphia. Imagine being in their position. Would desperation ever drive you to such extremes? The success of Martha and Eleanor's murderous enterprise depended on more than just their own actions. It required a network of complicit individuals who, whether knowingly or unknowingly, facilitated their crimes. At Pennsylvania Hospital, this network had grown like a cancer throughout the institution, corrupting everything it touched. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the chief of staff for the lying-in department, was not Eleanor's relation despite sharing her surname, a coincidence that Martha had exploited to create confusion about Eleanor's background. Dr. Hartwell was a man whose medical ethics had been compromised by years of gambling debts and a taste for expensive whiskey. When Martha began providing him with regular donations for the department, ostensibly from grateful patients, he asked no questions about their source. More importantly, Dr. Hartwell had developed a dependency on Martha's expertise that blinded him to the irregularities in her practice. She had saved his reputation more than once by successfully managing difficult cases that he had botched, and her knowledge of medicinal herbs and surgical techniques often surpassed his own. In exchange for her loyal assistance, he gave her unprecedented autonomy in managing the ward's day-to-day operations. The hospital's burial detail was managed by Silas Crowe, a gravedigger who had worked at Pennsylvania Hospital since 1835. Crowe had noticed the increasing number of unmarked graves being dug for the lying-in ward's patients, but the extra coins that appeared in his pay envelope each month ensured his continued silence. He had learned not to ask questions about the women who arrived at the morgue wrapped in blood-stained sheets, their faces bearing expressions of terror that no peaceful death should have produced. Eleanor had also cultivated relationships with several boarding house proprietors throughout the city. Mrs. Margaret O'Brien, who operated a rooming house near the docks, regularly directed pregnant women to Pennsylvania Hospital's lying-in ward, receiving a small commission for each referral. She told herself that she was helping desperate women find medical care, choosing not to examine why so few of her referrals ever returned to collect their belongings. The city's coroner, Dr. William Patterson, had grown increasingly lazy in his investigations of deaths at Pennsylvania Hospital. The lying-in ward's mortality rate should have triggered questions, but Martha had been careful to cultivate a relationship with Patterson's wife, providing her with herbal remedies for her chronic headaches and occasionally assisting with difficult social situations. When death certificates needed to be signed, Patterson rarely bothered to examine the bodies personally, trusting Martha's clinical assessments and detailed reports. This web of complicity extended even to the hospital's administrative staff. The clerks who recorded admissions and deaths had been trained by Eleanor to accept simplified paperwork for charity cases, often recording only first names and general locations rather than complete addresses. When families occasionally inquired about missing relatives, the incomplete records made it impossible to trace what had happened to their loved ones. The system had become self-perpetuating, with each participant and having reasons to maintain their silence and continue their cooperation. How many people do you think knew something was wrong but chose to look the other way? The winter of 1841 brought Philadelphia its harshest cold in decades, but inside Pennsylvania Hospital's lying-in ward, a different kind of chill had settled over the proceedings. Martha Blackwood stood at the frost-covered window, watching snowflakes dance in the gaslight as she counted the month's profits. December had been particularly lucrative. Desperation and cold weather drove more women to seek their services than ever before. Eleanor entered the room carrying a steaming cup of tea, her breath visible in the inadequately heated ward. The hospital's administration had reduced heating costs by closing off sections of the building, leaving the charity wards perpetually cold. This suited Martha and Eleanor perfectly. The uncomfortable conditions meant fewer unexpected visitors and gave them a medical excuse for the high mortality rate among their patients. "The Kelligan girl won't last the night," Eleanor reported matter-of-factly, referring to their current patient. "I've given her enough laudanum to ensure she won't be screaming when the end comes." Mary Kelligan, 19 years old and 8 months pregnant, had arrived from County Cork with her husband just 3 weeks earlier. When Patrick Kelligan lost his job at the shipyard, Mary's pregnancy became a burden they could no longer afford. Eleanor had found them in a tavern near the docks, selling their few possessions to buy passage back to Ireland. A quiet conversation and the promise of a solution to their problem had brought Mary to the hospital, while Patrick waited in a boarding house for his wife's return. Martha nodded approvingly. The Irish immigrants were particularly valuable clients because their transient nature meant disappearances often went unnoticed. Patrick Kelligan would eventually assume his wife had died in childbirth, a common enough occurrence that would arouse no suspicion. The baby, if it survived the birth, could be sold to one of Eleanor's contacts in the adoption trade, adding to their profits. But Mary Kelligan represented more than just another transaction. She was part of a pattern that Martha and Eleanor had perfected over the course of the year. They had learned to identify the most vulnerable women, those with no family support, limited English, and desperate financial circumstances. These women could be eliminated with minimal risk, their disappearances explained away as natural deaths or voluntary departures. The process had become almost mechanical in its efficiency. Eleanor would identify potential victims, Martha would perform the necessary procedures to ensure their deaths, and their network of complicit individuals would handle the cleanup. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves, personal effects were sold or disposed of, and any inquiries were deflected through a combination of medical jargon and administrative confusion. As snow continued to fall outside, Martha calculated that they had killed at least 47 women and 31 infants since the beginning of the year. The exact number was difficult to determine because they had also performed legitimate medical services for paying clients, mixing murder with medicine in a way that made their crimes nearly impossible to detect. The Kelligan case would bring their total to 48 mothers dead by year's end. If you lived in their neighborhood, what signs might have made you suspicious? Rebecca Sullivan was 7 years old when she became the first person to witness the true nature of Martha and Eleanor's operation. The daughter of a hospital laundress, Rebecca often accompanied her mother to work during the early morning hours, helping to sort and fold the endless mountains of blood-stained sheets that came from he lying in ward. On the morning of December 23, 1841, Rebecca had wandered away from the laundry room while her mother, Catherine, attended to a particularly challenging stain. The child had always been curious about the hospital's upper floors, fascinated by the mysterious sounds that echoed through the corridors, sometimes screaming, sometimes sobbing, sometimes an eerie silence that seemed to press against the walls themselves. The lying-in ward was supposed to be off-limits to everyone except medical staff and patients, but Rebecca was small and quick, able to slip past the distracted orderlies who were more concerned with their morning duties than with chasing wayward children. She climbed the narrow servants' staircase to the 3rd floor, her small feet making no sound on the worn wooden steps. What she saw when she peered through the partially open door of the ward's main room would haunt her for the rest of her life. Martha Blackwood stood over a young woman lying motionless on a delivery table, her hands covered in blood up to the wrists. But it wasn't the blood that terrified Rebecca. She had seen plenty of that in the laundry. It was Martha's expression, a look of cold satisfaction as she examined something in her hands, something small and still that should have been moving, should have been crying. Eleanor stood nearby, wrapping a tiny bundle in a stained cloth. She moved with practiced efficiency, showing no emotion as she placed the bundle in a wooden crate that already contained several similar packages. The sweet, cloying smell of death hung heavy in the air, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and something else, something chemical that made Rebecca's eyes water. "Another one for Crow," Eleanor said quietly, making a mark in her ledger. "Tell him to dig deep this time. We can't have them surfacing again like last month." Rebecca watched in frozen horror as Martha began cleaning her instruments, humming softly to herself as if she had just completed the most ordinary task imaginable. The woman on the table never moved, never breathed, never opened her eyes to see the winter sunlight streaming through the frost-covered windows. When Rebecca finally found the courage to move, she backed away from the door so quickly that she stumbled, her small body hitting the wall with a soft thud. The sound was barely audible, but in the quiet of the ward, it rang like a church bell. Eleanor's head snapped toward the doorway, her eyes scanning for the source of the noise. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. She held her breath until her lungs burned, waiting for Eleanor to lose interest and return to her grisly work. Do you think a 7-year-old could have stopped what was happening, or would speaking up have put her in danger? Rebecca Sullivan ran down the servants' staircase so fast her feet barely touched the steps, her small lungs burning as she gasped for air that seemed too thick to breathe. When she reached the laundry room, she found her mother bent over a wash basin, scrubbing furiously at a sheet that had been stained so heavily with blood it looked like someone had used it to wrap raw meat. "Mama," Rebecca whispered, tugging at Catherine's worn dress. "Mama, I saw—" "Hush, child," Catherine scolded without looking up from her work. "You're not supposed to be wandering off. Stay here and help me fold these linens." But Rebecca couldn't focus on folding. The image of Martha's blood-covered hands and Eleanor's methodical wrapping of tiny bundles played over and over in her mind like a horrible magic lantern show. "Mama, the ladies upstairs, they're hurting the babies. I saw them put babies in a box and the mama wasn't moving and there was so much blood." Catherine's hands stilled on the wash basin. She looked at her daughter with a mixture of concern and fear that made Rebecca's stomach twist into knots. "What ladies, Rebecca? What exactly did you see?" Rebecca described everything. Martha's satisfied expression, Eleanor's ledger, the wooden crate full of wrapped bundles, the chemical smell that burned her nose. With each detail, Catherine's face grew paler, her hands gripping the edge of the wash basin until her knuckles turned white. When Rebecca finished her account, Catherine sat down heavily on a wooden stool, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She had worked at Pennsylvania Hospital for 5 years, and she had noticed things: the unusually large number of sheets that came down from the lying-in ward, the strange stains that required special attention, the way Martha Blackwood and Eleanor Hartwell always seemed to have more money than their positions should provide. But Catherine Sullivan was a poor Irish immigrant with a daughter to feed and no husband to support them. She had learned to keep her head down, do her work, and ask no questions about things that didn't concern her. Speaking up against respectable medical professionals would mean losing her job, and losing her job would mean starvation for both her and Rebecca. "Promise me something, Rebecca," Catherine whispered, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eye. "Promise me you'll never go up to that ward again, never speak of what you saw to anyone else. Promise me." Rebecca nodded, though she didn't understand why her mother looked so frightened. She didn't know that Catherine had just made the most difficult decision of her life, choosing her daughter's safety over the lives of unknown women who might still be saved. That night, Catherine Sullivan lay awake in their tiny room above the baker's shop, staring at the ceiling and wondering how many other people knew what was happening in the lying-in ward and had made the same choice she had made. What would you have done in Catherine's position? Risk everything to save strangers, or protect your own child? While Rebecca Sullivan struggled with the weight of her terrible knowledge, another witness to Martha and Eleanor's crimes was methodically documenting their activities with the precision of a natural historian. Dr. Jacob Whitmore had been appointed as Pennsylvania Hospital's assistant pathologist in September of 1841, and his duties included reviewing all deaths that occurred within the institution's walls. Whitmore was a meticulous man, possessed of the kind of analytical mind that noticed patterns where others saw only coincidences. He had studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where he had been trained in the new scientific approaches to understanding disease and death. Unlike many of his American colleagues, he believed that careful observation and detailed record-keeping could reveal truths that casual examination would miss. Within his first month at Pennsylvania Hospital, Whitmore had noticed irregularities in the mortality reports from the lying-in ward. The death rate was extraordinarily high, nearly 3 times higher than similar institutions in Boston and New York. More troubling still, the causes of death listed on the certificates often seemed inconsistent with the physical evidence he observed during his examinations. Whitmore began keeping his own private ledger, recording not just the official causes of death but his own observations about the condition of the bodies brought to the morgue. What he discovered disturbed him profoundly. Many of the women who had supposedly died from complications during childbirth showed signs of deliberate poisoning, a grayish pallor around the lips, contracted pupils, and a distinctive sweet odor that he recognized from his studies of various toxic substances. The infants were even more troubling. Those listed as stillborn often showed evidence of having lived for several minutes after birth before dying from what appeared to be deliberate asphyxiation. Small hemorrhages in their eyes and fingernail marks around their throats told a story that had nothing to do with natural infant mortality. By December of 1841, Whitmore had documented 23 suspicious deaths in the lying-in ward, each one representing what he believed to be deliberate murder. He had also begun to notice patterns in the timing of these deaths. They clustered around periods when Martha Blackwood was working alone, or when Eleanor Hartwell had been seen entering the ward carrying her leather medical bag. The problem Whitmore faced was one of proof and politics. His position at the hospital was temporary, and accusing established medical professionals of murder without absolute certainty would end his career before it had truly begun. Moreover, the hospital's administration had little interest in scandals that might damage their reputation and reduce donations from wealthy benefactors. Whitmore decided to continue his documentation while quietly gathering additional evidence. He began arriving at the hospital earlier and staying later, hoping to observe Martha and Eleanor's activities directly. He also started building relationships with other hospital staff, carefully probing to see if anyone else had noticed the troubling patterns in the lying-in ward. What he didn't know was that Eleanor Hartwell had already noticed his increased attention and was beginning to consider him a threat that needed to be eliminated. How long do you think Dr. Whitmore could continue his investigation before becoming a target himself? January 15th, 1842. The full moon cast an ethereal glow over the snow-covered streets of Philadelphia, turning the night into a dreamscape of silver shadows and stark contrasts. Inside Pennsylvania Hospital, the gas lamps flickered with their usual rhythm, but in the lying-in ward, something different was happening, something that would finally provide Dr. Jacob Whitmore with the evidence he had been desperately seeking. G.E. Margaret Flynn had arrived at the hospital 3 hours earlier, her labor pains forcing her to seek help. Despite her terror of medical institutions, an Irish immigrant whose husband had died in a factory accident 6 months prior, Margaret had no money for a private physician and no family to assist with the birth. The lying-in ward's reputation as a place where poor women could receive medical care had drawn her to Pennsylvania Hospital's doors. What Margaret didn't know was that Eleanor Hartwell had already marked her as a perfect victim. A widow with no local connections, Margaret carried her life savings, $12.37, sewn into the lining of her coat. More importantly, she had mentioned to Eleanor that she planned to surrender the child for adoption, having no means to support an infant on her own. Dr. Whitmore had been working late in the morgue, examining the body of another lying-in ward patient who had died that afternoon, when he heard voices in the corridor above. The hospital should have been nearly empty at that hour, with only a skeleton crew of night attendants on duty. Curious, he climbed the narrow staircase to investigate, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn wooden steps. Through a crack in the door, Whitmore watched as Martha Blackwood prepared a syringe filled with a clear liquid that he immediately recognized as a lethal dose of morphine. Margaret Flynn lay on the delivery table, her newborn son crying weakly in Eleanor's arms. The birth had been successful, both mother and child were healthy and should have survived without complications. "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let me hold my baby. Just once." Martha's response was to inject the morphine directly into Margaret's arm, her movements swift and practiced. "This will help with the pain, dear. You'll feel better soon." Whitmore watched in horror as Margaret's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Eleanor, meanwhile, had placed the crying infant face down on a pillow, pressing firmly until the weak cries stopped entirely. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, executed with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed performance. As Martha began cleaning up the evidence and Eleanor prepared the death certificate, Whitmore carefully backed away from the door. He had finally seen what he needed to see, but he also realized that his own life was now in immediate danger. If Martha and Eleanor discovered that he had witnessed their murders, he would undoubtedly become their next victim. The question was no longer whether he had enough evidence to expose them, it was whether he would survive long enough to do it. Would you have confronted them immediately or tried to escape and report what you witnessed? Dr. Jacob Whitmore's hands trembled as he descended the morgue stairs, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. The methodical murder of Margaret Flynn and her infant son had confirmed his worst suspicions, but it had also placed him in mortal peril. He knew that Martha and Eleanor would not hesitate to kill him if they discovered his knowledge of their crimes. Reaching his office, Whitmore locked the door and lit an additional oil lamp, the extra light making the small room feel marginally safer. He opened his private ledger and began documenting every detail of what he had observed, his physician's training helping him maintain clinical precision despite his shaking hands. The more he wrote, the clearer the pattern became. Martha and Eleanor had been systematically murdering their patients for months, possibly years. What Whitmore didn't know was that Eleanor had developed the habit of conducting sweeps of the hospital after their murders, checking for potential witnesses and evidence that needed to be cleaned up. Her mother's intuition for danger, honed by years of survival in Philadelphia's worst neighborhoods, had saved her from discovery on numerous occasions. As Eleanor climbed the stairs from the main floor, she noticed light coming from beneath the morgue office door. Dr. Whitmore typically left the hospital by evening, and his presence at nearly midnight was highly unusual. Moving silently in her soft-soled shoes, Eleanor positioned herself outside the office and listened to the scratch of pen on paper, the occasional pause, and the sound of pages turning. Through the keyhole she could see Whitmore bent over his desk, writing frantically in what appeared to be a personal journal or ledger. The intensity of his work and the late hour suggested that he was documenting something urgent and secretive, something that posed a direct threat to her and Martha's operation. Eleanor retreated to the lying-in ward, where Martha was finishing the cleanup from Margaret Flynn's murder. "We have a problem," she whispered, quickly explaining what she had observed in the morgue. Martha's expression hardened as she listened, her clinical mind immediately grasping the implications. "How much do you think he knows?" Martha asked, setting down her blood-stained instruments. "Enough to destroy us," Eleanor replied. "We need to eliminate him before he can act on whatever he's discovered." The two women began planning Whitmore's murder with the same methodical approach they applied to all their crimes. They would need to make his death appear accidental or natural, as the sudden demise of a hospital pathologist would attract unwanted attention. They also needed to recover and destroy whatever evidence he had compiled in his private documentation. As they plotted, neither woman realized that their conversation was being overheard by young Rebecca Sullivan, who had been unable to sleep and was wandering the hospital corridors where her mother worked the night shift. The web of witnesses was growing more complex, and the body count was about to increase dramatically. Do you think Dr. Whitmore had any chance of survival once they identified him as a threat? Martha Blackwood had learned the art of poison during her apprenticeship with Dr. Thomas Chalky James, though her mentor had intended his teachings for healing rather than harm. In the medical supply room of Pennsylvania Hospital, she kept a collection of substances that could cure or kill depending on dosage and application: digitalis for heart conditions, morphine for pain relief, and strychnine for killing rats in the hospital's basement. But Martha's specialty was a particular compound she had perfected over months of experimentation, a mixture of antimony and arsenic that produced symptoms resembling natural illness while causing a slow, agonizing death. She had tested various formulations on her victims in the lying-in ward, carefully noting the effects and refining her formula until she achieved what she considered the perfect murder weapon. Dr. Jacob Whitmore had been studying late into the night for 3 consecutive evenings, trying to determine the best way to expose Martha and Eleanor's crimes without putting himself in immediate danger. He had considered approaching Dr. Hartwell, the chief of staff, but Whitmore suspected that Hartwell's gambling debts had made him complicit in the murderous scheme. The hospital's administration seemed either ignorant or willfully blind to what was happening in the lying-in ward. On January 18, 1842, Whitmore made the decision to contact authorities outside the hospital. He spent the morning drafting a detailed letter to Philadelphia's chief of police, outlining his observations and requesting a discreet investigation. He planned to deliver the letter personally after his shift ended, but first he wanted to review his documentation one final time to ensure that his accusations were supported by irrefutable evidence. Martha had been watching Whitmore's activities for days, noting his altered schedule and increased nervousness. When she observed him writing what appeared to be official correspondence, she knew that immediate action was required. She prepared a dose of her special poison and waited for the right opportunity to administer it. The opportunity came during Whitmore's lunch break, when he left his office to eat in the hospital's small physician dining room. Martha entered the morgue and added her poison to Whitmore's water pitcher, stirring it carefully to ensure complete dissolution. The compound was tasteless and odorless, designed to be undetectable until its effects became irreversible. When Whitmore returned to his office, he felt thirsty from the morning's tension and anxiety. He poured himself a full glass of water and drank it while reviewing his letter to the police. Within minutes, he began to feel dizzy and nauseated, symptoms he initially attributed to stress and lack of sleep. As the poison began to take effect, Whitmore realized with growing horror that he was experiencing the same symptoms he had documented in so many of Martha's victims. His analytical mind understood what was happening even as his body began to fail, and he used his remaining strength to hide his evidence where Martha would never think to look. Could Whitmore's hidden evidence still expose Martha and Eleanor, or would his death silence the truth forever? Dr. Jacob Whitmore's vision blurred as he felt his strength ebbing away, but his physician's training allowed him to recognize the progression of the poison now coursing through his veins. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the compound reached lethal concentrations in his bloodstream, and he was determined to use those minutes to ensure that his death would not silence the truth about Martha and Eleanor's crimes. Fighting against waves of nausea and dizziness, Whitmore pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing in large, desperate letters. "I have been poisoned by Martha Blackwood and Eleanor Hartwell. They have murdered dozens of women and children in the lying-in ward. My evidence is hidden." The pen slipped from his fingers as a violent convulsion racked his body. Whitmore forced himself to continue, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. "Behind the false panel in the morgue's east wall, tell Catherine Sullivan her daughter saw the truth. They must be stopped before more innocents die." As his hands began to shake uncontrollably, Whitmore folded the letter and used his remaining coordination to climb onto his desk chair, reaching up to wedge the note between two ceiling beams where it would be invisible from below but discoverable by anyone who searched the office thoroughly. Martha Blackwood arrived at Whitmore's office 20 minutes later, concerned that her poison was taking longer than usual to complete its work. She found him collapsed on the floor beside his overturned chair, his breathing shallow and irregular. His skin had taken on the grayish pallor that she had seen so many times before, and she knew that death would claim him within minutes. "Dr. Whitmore," she called loudly, performing for any potential witnesses. "Dr. Whitmore, can you hear me?" She knelt beside him, checking his pulse with apparent concern while actually ensuring that the poison was doing its work properly. Whitmore's eyes focused on her face with tremendous effort, and she saw recognition there, a clear understanding of what she had done and why. "You know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know you've been working too hard," Martha replied sweetly, her tone carrying no hint of the menace behind her words. "Heart failure, I would guess. So common among men of your age and profession. The stress of examining all those bodies, the long hours, the irregular meals." As Whitmore's breathing stopped, Martha began her performance as the concerned colleague who had discovered his tragic death. She would claim that she had found him collapsed in his office, apparently the victim of a sudden cardiac episode. The hospital's administration would accept her diagnosis without question, and Dr. Whitmore would be buried alongside his victims, his secrets seemingly dying with him. But Martha didn't know about the letter hidden in the ceiling beams, or about young Rebecca Sullivan, who was hiding in the supply closet and had heard every word of their conversation. How many more people would have to die before someone finally found the courage to expose the truth? Rebecca Sullivan pressed her small body deeper into the supply closet, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give her away. She had been helping her mother organize medical supplies when Dr. Whitmore's agonized voice had drawn her attention, and she had witnessed the entire encounter between the dying physician and Martha Blackwood. Unlike the night when she had seen the murders in the lying-in ward, Rebecca now understood exactly what she was witnessing. Martha had killed Dr. Whitmore just as she had killed all those mothers and babies, and she was going to get away with it unless someone stopped her. Rebecca waited until Martha's footsteps faded down the corridor before emerging from her hiding place. The morgue office felt different now, heavy with the presence of death and the lingering smell of Martha's perfume mixed with something chemical and wrong. Dr. Whitmore lay motionless on the floor, his eyes staring at nothing, his face frozen in an expression of desperate determination. Looking up at the ceiling where she had seen Whitmore hide something before Martha arrived, Rebecca dragged a chair over and climbed up carefully. Her small fingers found the folded paper wedged between the beams, and she pulled it free, her hands trembling as she read the words that would change everything. The letter confirmed what she had seen in the lying-in ward and provided details that made her stomach turn. But more importantly, it mentioned her mother by name and revealed that Whitmore knew about Rebecca's a witness to Martha and Eleanor's crimes. He had believed her story, had investigated it, and had died trying to expose the truth. Rebecca heard footsteps in the corridor and quickly folded the letter, tucking it into the pocket of her dress. When Martha returned with Dr. Hartwell and 2 orderlies, Rebecca was standing beside her mother, who had arrived to investigate the commotion. "Tragic," Dr. Hartwell was saying, examining Whitmore's body with perfunctory attention. The stress of his position must have overwhelmed his constitution. Heart failure, most likely. Martha nodded gravely. "I found him collapsed when I came to discuss tomorrow's autopsy schedule. Such a dedicated physician, perhaps too dedicated for his own good." Catherine Sullivan pulled her daughter closer, sensing the child's distress, but not understanding its cause. She had noticed Rebecca's increasing nervousness over the past few weeks, the way the girl startled at sudden sounds and seemed afraid to be alone in certain parts of the hospital. As the men carried Dr. Whitmore's body away, Rebecca made a decision that would require more courage than any 7-year-old should need to possess. She would find someone outside the hospital who would listen to her story and believe her evidence. She would make sure that Dr. Whitmore's death meant something, that Martha and Eleanor's crimes would finally be exposed. But first, she had to survive long enough to find that person, and Martha Blackwood was watching her with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had just realized that a potential witness was still alive. Do you think a 7-year-old child could convince adults to take action against respected medical professionals? Martha Blackwood's instincts had been honed by months of successful murder, and something about young Rebecca Sullivan's behavior in Dr. Whitmore's office troubled her deep. 10. The child had been present at precisely the wrong moment, had positioned herself where she could observe everything, and was now displaying signs of knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess about adult matters. Eleanor shared Martha's concerns when they discussed the situation later that evening. They had noticed Rebecca's increased presence around the hospital, her tendency to appear in unexpected places, and most troubling of all, the way she seemed to watch them with an intelligence that was far too mature for her age. "The child knows something," Eleanor stated with certainty. "I've seen that look before. She's carrying secrets that could destroy us." Martha nodded grimly. Her mother, Catherine, is also a potential problem. If the child has been talking to her, we may have 2 witnesses instead of 1. The 2 women began planning their most dangerous murders yet. Killing Dr. Whitmore had been risky but manageable. Physicians died from overwork and stress regularly enough that his death would not attract unusual attention. But murdering a child and her mother would require careful planning and perfect execution to avoid arousing suspicion. Their opportunity came 3 days later when Catherine Sullivan was scheduled to work alone during the night shift. The hospital's regular night supervisor had taken ill, leaving Catherine responsible for cleaning the entire building without assistance. This isolation would provide the perfect cover for what Martha and Eleanor had planned. Rebecca had been staying at the hospital with her mother more frequently since Dr. Whitmore's death, partly because she was afraid to be alone, and partly because she was still searching for an adult who might listen to her story. The letter remained hidden in her dress pocket, growing more worn each day as she touched it repeatedly for reassurance. On the night of January 23rd, 1842, Rebecca fell asleep in the small cot that her mother had set up in the supply room. She was awakened around midnight by the sound of footsteps in the corridor, footsteps. P.S. that she recognized as belonging to Martha and Eleanor. Peering through a crack in the door, Rebecca saw the two women approaching the laundry room where her mother was working. Martha carried her leather medical bag, while Eleanor held a length of rope that she was testing with small, sharp tugs. The intent was clear, and Rebecca realized with horror that she and her mother were about to become the next victims. With the instincts of a child who had learned to survive by staying invisible, Rebecca slipped out of the supply room and began following the two women, staying far enough back to avoid detection but close enough to see what they were planning to do to her mother. Could a 7-year-old child possibly save her mother from two experienced killers? Or was this the night when the truth would die with them both? Section 15. The Laundry Room Confrontation. 450 words. Catherine Sullivan hummed softly as she worked, the familiar rhythm of washing and folding providing some comfort during the long, lonely night shift. She had been thinking about Rebecca's increasingly strange behavior, the way her daughter seemed perpetually frightened and kept mentioning things about the lying-in ward that a child shouldn't know or understand. The laundry room was located in the hospital's basement, a cramped space lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The isolation that usually made Catherine's work peaceful now felt ominous, as if the darkness beyond the lamp's reach contained watching eyes and waiting dangers. Martha and Eleanor approached silently, their soft-soled shoes making no sound on the damp stone floor. They had planned this murder carefully. Catherine would be strangled with Eleanor's rope, her death staged to appear as if she had been attacked by an intruder who had broken into the hospital seeking valuables. Rebecca would be found at their eyes in the morning, apparently smothered in her sleep by the same criminal. But as Martha reached for the door handle, a small voice spoke from the darkness behind them. "I know what you did to Dr. Whitmore." Both women spun around to find Rebecca standing at the bottom of the staircase, Dr. Whitmore's letter clutched in her small hands. In the dim light she looked like a tiny ghost, her white nightgown making her appear almost translucent against the stone walls. "And I know what you did to all those mothers and babies in the lying-in ward," Rebecca continued, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Dr. Whitmore wrote it all down. He said you poisoned him, and he was right." Eleanor's hand tightened on the rope as she took a step toward the child. "You're having bad dreams, little girl. You should be in bed." "I'm not dreaming," Rebecca replied, unfolding Whitmore's letter. "I can read, and I know what this says." Dr. Whitmore hid his evidence behind the false panel in the morgue's east wall. He wrote about how you killed Margaret Flynn and her baby, and Mary Kelligan and all the others. Martha's medical mind raced to assess this new threat. The child clearly possessed dangerous knowledge, but she was also presenting them with crucial information about the location of Whitmore's hidden evidence. If they could eliminate both Rebecca and her mother while recovering and destroying Whitmore's documentation, they could eliminate all threats to their operation. "Why don't you come here, Rebecca?" Martha said in her most soothing voice, the same tone she had used to calm dozens of victims before their deaths. "We can discuss this properly. Perhaps we can help you understand what you think you've seen." But Rebecca had learned not to trust Martha's gentle words. Instead, she called out as loudly as her small lungs would allow. "Mama! Mama! Run! They're trying to kill you!" Would Catherine believe her daughter's warning in time to save them both? Or had Martha and Eleanor finally cornered their most dangerous witnesses? Catherine Sullivan's hands froze on the wet sheet she was wringing out as her daughter's terrified voice echoed through the basement. The words Rebecca was shouting made no sense. Accusations about murder and poison directed at two of the hospital's most respected medical professionals. but the raw terror in her child's voice cut through any rational doubt. "Rebecca, what are you?" Catherine began. But Eleanor Hartwell's appearance in the laundry room doorway cut her words short. The young woman's expression was nothing like the professional demeanor Catherine had observed during their occasional interactions. Instead, Eleanor's face showed cold calculation and murderous intent that made Catherine's blood turn to ice. "I'm afraid your daughter has been having disturbing dreams," Eleanor said, the rope now visible in her hands. "We've come to help her understand the difference between fantasy and reality." Martha appeared beside Eleanor, her medical bag in one hand and a syringe in the other. "Children often create elaborate stories to explain things they don't understand. Rebecca seems to have developed some very troubling delusions about our medical work." Catherine's mind raced as she began to understand the impossible truth. Her daughter's strange stories about murdered babies and dead mothers hadn't been nightmares or childish fantasies. Rebecca had been witnessing actual crimes, and now both of them were in mortal danger. "Stay back," Catherine warned, grabbing a heavy iron from the laundry table. "I don't know what you've been doing, but I won't let you hurt my daughter." Eleanor laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, Catherine. You and your daughter know things that could cause problems for very important people. We're simply here to solve those problems." Rebecca darted past the two women and ran to her mother's side, pressing Whitmore's letter into Catherine's free hand. "Read it, Mama. Dr. Whitmore wrote down everything before they poisoned him. He said we were the only ones who could stop them." Catherine's eyes widened as she scanned the physician's desperate final words. The clinical details of poison symptoms, the references to hidden evidence, and the specific mention of her daughter's witness testimony painted a picture of systematic murder that made her stomach revolt. "How many?" Catherine whispered, her voice hoarse with horror. "How many women have you killed?" "Does it matter?" Martha replied, raising the syringe. "You'll be joining them soon enough, both of you." But Catherine Sullivan had not survived years of poverty and hardship by surrendering when faced with insurmountable odds. Gripping the iron tighter, she positioned herself between her daughter and the two killers, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "Rebecca, run," she commanded. "Run upstairs and find help. Tell them everything, no matter whether they believe you or not." Was Catherine strong enough to hold off two experienced killers long enough for her daughter to escape? The laundry room erupted into chaos as Catherine Sullivan swung the heavy iron at Martha's head, the weapon whistling through the air with enough force to crush bone. Martha ducked backward, the iron missing her skull by inches and striking the stone wall with a shower of sparks. Eleanor lunged forward with the rope, trying to loop it around Catherine's neck from behind, but the Irish woman had learned to fight during her years in Philadelphia's worst neighborhoods. She drove her elbow backward into Eleanor's ribs, feeling satisfaction as her attacker gasped in pain and staggered away. "Rebecca, go!" Catherine shouted, swinging the iron again as Martha tried to approach with the syringe. "Find someone, anyone, and tell them what you've seen." But Rebecca hesitated, unwilling to abandon her mother to face the killers alone. "Mama, I can't leave you. You have to!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You're the only one who can stop them. Dr. Whitmore died trying to expose them, and if we both die here, they'll keep killing." Eleanor had recovered from the elbow to her ribs and was circling around toward Rebecca, her rope ready to silence the child permanently. But Rebecca was small and quick, darting between the laundry tables and keeping obstacles between herself and her pursuer. Martha, meanwhile, had abandoned her syringe in favor of a more direct approach. She grabbed a heavy wooden washboard and brought it down toward Catherine's head with murderous force. Catherine rolled aside at the last moment, the board splintering against the stone floor where her skull had been a second earlier. The noise of the struggle was tremendous in the confined space, breaking wood, clanging metal, and the harsh breathing of 4 people fighting for their lives. Catherine prayed that someone in the hospital above would hear the commotion and investigate, though she knew that the basement's stone walls muffled sound effectively. Eleanor made another grab for Rebecca, her fingers catching the child's nightgown and yanking her backward. Rebecca stumbled but managed to pull free, leaving a torn piece of fabric in Eleanor's grasp. She scrambled up the basement stairs, her bare feet slipping on the worn wooden steps. Behind her, she could hear her mother's continued struggle with Martha, punctuated by crashes and thuds that made her heart race with terror. Catherine was buying her time with her own life, creating the opportunity for Rebecca to reach safety and expose the truth that had cost Dr. Whitmore his life. As Rebecca reached the top of the stairs, she could hear Eleanor pursuing her, the woman's heavier footsteps gaining ground despite Rebecca's head start. The hospital's main floor stretched before her like a maze filled with shadows and hiding places, but also offering potential salvation if she could find the right person to trust with her terrible secret. Could a 7-year-old child navigate the dark hospital corridors and find help before Eleanor caught her? Thomas McKenna had been Pennsylvania Hospital's night watchman for 12 years, and he had developed the ability to sleep lightly while maintaining awareness of unusual sounds that might indicate problems requiring his attention. The commotion from the basement had awakened him instantly, though he initially assumed it was simply Catherine Sullivan moving heavy equipment during her cleaning duties. But as the noise continued and intensified, McKenna realized that something more serious was occurring. The sound of splintering wood and what appeared to be a violent struggle sent him hurrying downstairs with his lantern and the club he carried for dealing with intruders. Rebecca reached the main floor just as McKenna was descending toward the basement, their paths crossing in the central corridor. The child's terrified appearance, torn nightgown, bare feet, and tears streaming down her face, immediately alarmed the veteran watchman. "Child, what's happened?" McKenna asked, kneeling down to Rebecca's level. "Why are you running about the hospital at this hour?" "They're killing my mama," Rebecca sobbed, pressing Dr. Whitmore's letter into McKenna's weathered hands. "The midwife ladies. They've been murdering all the mothers and babies, and now they're trying to kill us because we know." McKenna's first instinct was to dismiss the child's words as the product of nightmares or imagination, but Rebecca's obvious terror and the sounds of conflict still echoing from the basement convinced him to take her seriously. He unfolded Whitmore's letter, his limited reading skills enough to grasp the physician's desperate final message. "Stay behind me," McKenna commanded, raising his club as Eleanor Hartwell appeared at the top of the basement stairs. The young woman's disheveled appearance and the rope's till clutched in her hands confirmed that Rebecca's hysterical account was based in reality. Eleanor stopped abruptly when she saw McKenna, her calculating mind immediately assessing this new threat. The night watchman was a large, strong man who could easily overpower her in a direct confrontation, but he was also isolated and had no immediate way to summon additional help. "Thomas," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to sound calm and professional. "Thank goodness you're here. This child has been having some kind of episode, making wild accusations. I'm afraid she may have hurt her mother during her fit." But McKenna had spent years learning to read people, and Eleanor's explanation didn't match what he observed. The rope, the child's terror, and most importantly the letter from Dr. Whitmore created a picture that made Eleanor's words ring false. "We'll see about that," McKenna replied grimly, moving toward the basement stairs. "Rebecca, you stay right here where I can see you. Don't move until I come back." As McKenna descended into the basement, Eleanor realized that her and Martha's carefully constructed operation was finally beginning to unravel, and they would need to take increasingly desperate measures to protect themselves. Would McKenna's intervention come in time to save Catherine Sullivan, or was he about to become another victim of Martha and Eleanor's murderous scheme? McKenna's lantern cast dancing shadows on the basement walls as he descended, the sounds of struggle growing louder with each step. When he reached the laundry room doorway, the scene that greeted him confirmed his worst fears about what had been happening at Pennsylvania Hospital. Catherine Sullivan lay on the stone floor, blood streaming from a head wound where Martha's makeshift weapon had finally found its target. She was conscious but barely moving, her strength nearly exhausted from the prolonged fight. Martha stood over her with a heavy brass candlestick raised for a killing blow, her neat appearance completely destroyed by the violence of the struggle. "Stop! Right there!" McKenna commanded, his club ready for action. "Step away from her immediately!" Martha spun toward him, her face transformed by fury and desperation into something barely human. "You don't understand, Thomas. This woman and her child have been spreading malicious lies about our medical work. They're disturbed, dangerous. The only thing I understand is that you're about to murder an innocent woman," McKenna interrupted, advancing into the room. Drop that weapon and move away from her." Instead of complying, Martha lunged at McKenna with the candlestick, her medical knowledge giving her insight into where to strike for maximum damage. But McKenna's years of dealing with drunks, thieves, and violent patients had prepared him for such attacks. He deflected her weapon with his club and drove his shoulder into her midsection, sending her crashing into the stone wall. The impact stunned Martha momentarily, giving McKenna time to help Catherine to her feet. "Can you walk?" he asked urgently, aware that Eleanor was still upstairs with Rebecca and posed a continuing threat. I think so," Catherine gasped, leaning heavily on McKenna's arm. "Rebecca, is she safe?" "For now," McKenna replied, but his attention was focused on Martha, who was recovering from the collision with the wall faster than he had expected. Her medical bag had spilled its contents across the floor, revealing an assortment of syringes, vials, and surgical instruments that painted a disturbing picture of her true activities. Martha grabbed a scalpel from the scattered supplies and came at McKenna again, this time with the skill of someone who understood anatomy and knew exactly where to cut for fatal results. McKenna's club met her wrist with bone-crushing force, sending the scalpel spinning away across the room. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Martha snarled, rattling her broken wrist. "The work we've been doing here serves a greater purpose. Those women, those children, they were better off dead than living in poverty and shame." McKenna stared at her in horror, finally understanding the full scope of the evil that had been operating within the hospital's walls. "You're completely insane," he whispered. But even as Martha was being subdued, Eleanor was upstairs with Rebecca, and the night's violence was far from over. How many more people would be drawn into this confrontation before Martha and Eleanor were finally stopped? While McKenna was subduing Martha in the basement, Eleanor faced her own crisis on the main floor. Rebecca had positioned herself near the hospital's main entrance, close enough to escape if necessary, but determined not to abandon the building while her mother remained in danger. The child's courage, born from weeks of carrying impossible secrets, had transformed her terror into fierce determination. Eleanor approached slowly, her rope coiled and ready, but her usual confidence was shaken by the night's unexpected complications. The systematic murder operation that she and Martha had perfected was collapsing around them, and Eleanor's survival instincts were telling her to flee while she still could. "Rebecca," Eleanor said in what she hoped was a soothing tone, "you need to understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about life and death. The women we've helped, they were suffering. We ended their pain." "You killed them," Rebecca shot back, her 7-year-old voice carrying more moral authority than Eleanor's careful justifications. "You killed Dr. Whitmore because he was trying to stop you, and now you want to kill me and Mama because we know the truth." The sound of heavy footsteps on the basement stairs announced McKenna's approach, and Eleanor realized that her window for eliminating Rebecca was rapidly closing. She made a desperate lunge for the child, but Rebecca had been anticipating this move for several minutes and darted toward the hospital's main door. Eleanor's pursuit was hampered by her dress and the rope that had become tangled around her legs. Rebecca reached the heavy wooden door and began wrestling with the iron lock, her small fingers struggling with the mechanism that was designed to keep intruders out, but also prevented easy escape from within. "You can't run forever, little girl," Eleanor panted, closing the distance between them. "Even if you escape tonight, who's going to believe the word of a child against respected medical professionals?" But Rebecca's answer came not from her own voice, but from the sound of multiple footsteps echoing through the hospital corridors. McKenna had not only subdued Martha, but had also awakened other hospital staff members, and the approaching voices belonged to Dr. Hartwell and 2 orderlies who were responding to the disturbance. Eleanor heard her name being called and realized that McKenna had likely shared Rebecca's accusations with the newcomers. Her career, her freedom, and possibly her life now depended on her ability to convince these men that she was the victim of a child's fantasies rather than a cold-blooded killer. "Dr. Hartwell, thank goodness you're here," Eleanor called out, abandoning her pursuit of Rebecca and assuming her most professional demeanor. "This child has been having some kind of psychotic episode. She's made the most outrageous accusations and may have seriously injured her mother during her fit." But as the men approached, Eleanor could see doubt in their eyes, particularly when they noticed the rope in her hands and Rebecca's obvious terror. Would Eleanor's reputation and medical credentials protect her, or had too many witnesses finally seen the truth? Dr. Edmund Hartwell stood in the hospital's main corridor, his usual composure shattered by the impossible scene before him. McKenna had emerged from the basement Bjorgies, with a battered but alive Catherine Sullivan, while Martha Blackwood followed with her hands bound behind her back, her broken wrist cradled against her body. Eleanor stood frozen near the main door, the rope still visible in her grasp despite her attempts to hide it. "Thomas, explain to me what's happening here," Dr. Hartwell demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The night's revelations were forcing him to confront the possibility that his gambling debts and willful ignorance had made him complicit in unspeakable crimes. McKenna held up Dr. Whitmore's letter, now stained with blood from the basement struggle. "Jacob Whitmore wrote this before he died, Dr. Hartwell. He documents murders, dozens of them, committed by these two women in the lying-in ward. The child here witnessed some of their crimes, and they tried to kill her and her mother tonight to keep them quiet." Eleanor made one final attempt to control the situation through deception. "Dr. Hartwell, surely you can see that this is madness. I've devoted my career to helping women through childbirth. The idea that I would harm my patients is beyond comprehension." But Rebecca Sullivan, emboldened by the presence of multiple adult witnesses, stepped forward with the moral clarity that only a child could possess. "I saw you put babies in a wooden box," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I saw you give the mothers medicine that made them stop breathing. Dr. Whitmore saw it too, and that's why you poisoned him." Dr. Hartwell looked at Eleanor's face and saw the truth there. Not in her words, which continued to deny everything, but in her eyes, which showed the cold calculation of a predator whose hunting ground had finally been exposed. Martha, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense and was glaring at everyone present with undisguised hatred. "The evidence is hidden behind the false panel in the morgue's east wall," Catherine Sullivan said weakly, supported by McKenna's arm. "Dr. Whitmore wrote about it in his letter. Everything he discovered about their murders is documented there." One of the orderlies was dispatched to examine the morgue while another was sent to summon the police. As they waited, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. The magnitude of what had been happening within Pennsylvania Hospital's walls was beginning to sink in, and each person present was grappling with their own role in allowing such evil to flourish. Eleanor made a sudden break for the door, but McKenna's quick reflexes and the presence of multiple witnesses ended her escape attempt before it could begin. The rope that she had intended to use on Rebecca became the instrument of her own restraint as McKenna bound her hands with professional efficiency. The killing spree that had terrorized the lying-in ward for months was finally over, but the full extent of the horror was still being uncovered. How many victims would be discovered when authorities fully investigated Martha and Eleanor's crimes? The false panel behind the morgue's east wall yielded its secrets with shocking efficiency. Dr. Whitmore had been methodical in his documentation, creating a comprehensive record of Martha and Eleanor's crimes that read like a medical textbook written by the devil himself. Philadelphia's police chief, Captain William Morrison, arrived at dawn to find Pennsylvania Hospital in chaos. The lying-in ward had been sealed off as a crime scene, while Martha and Eleanor sat in shackles under guard in separate rooms. Morrison, a veteran of 20 years in law enforcement, thought he had seen every type of criminal brutality, but Whitmore's evidence revealed a level of systematic murder that exceeded his worst imaginings. The hidden documentation included detailed autopsy reports that contradicted the official death certificates, chemical analyses of suspicious substances found in Mrs. Blood, and a timeline that correlated suspicious deaths with Martha and Eleanor's work schedules. Most damning of all was Whitmore's account of witnessing Margaret Flynn's murder, written with the precision of a man who knew he was documenting evidence for his own murder trial. But the written evidence was only the beginning. When authorities examined the morgue more thoroughly, they discovered additional horrors that even Whitmore hadn't known about. Hidden beneath the building's foundation, in a space accessible only through a concealed entrance in the basement, lay the remains of infants who had been murdered and secretly buried to avoid questions about their disappearance. Eleanor's ledger, recovered from its hiding place beneath the floorboards, provided the financial records that revealed the full scope of their operation. The neat columns of figures told the story of women who had paid for services they never received, infants who had been sold into illegal adoption networks, and a systematic enterprise that had generated thousands of dollars in profit from human misery. Rebecca Sullivan, now safe in her mother's arms, provided additional testimony that corroborated Whitmore's written evidence. Her childish descriptions of what she had witnessed carried an authenticity that no adult fabrication could match, and her ability to recall specific details about dates, victims, and methods convinced even the most skeptical investigators. As the investigation expanded, more witnesses came forward. Other hospital staff members who had noticed irregularities began speaking openly about their suspicions. Boarding house operators admitted to receiving payments for referring desperate women to Pennsylvania Hospital. Even some of Martha's wealthy clients, faced with the possibility of being charged as accessories, provided information about the illegal services they had purchased. Dr. Hartwell's role in the conspiracy remained unclear, but his gambling debts and the suspicious donations he had received from Martha made him a person of interest in the investigation. The hospital's administration faced the possibility of criminal charges for their negligent oversight of the lying-in ward. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond anyone's initial expectations, and Philadelphia's newspapers were beginning to take notice of what would become one of the most shocking criminal cases in the city's history. How many people would ultimately be implicated in this web of murder and corruption? The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Martha Blackwood and Eleanor Hartwell opened on March 15, 1843, in Philadelphia's Court of Common Pleas. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators spilling into the corridors and street outside. Newspaper reporters from New York, Boston, and Washington had descended on Philadelphia to cover what was being called the most shocking murder trial in American history. Prosecutor James McNeil presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic murder spanning at least 3 years. The official count stood at 67 confirmed victims, 49 women and 18 infants, though investigators suspected the actual number was much higher. Many deaths had been so expertly concealed that they might never be fully documented. Martha Blackwood showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, maintaining her composure even as witnesses described the horrific details of her crimes. She had apparently convinced herself that her actions were medically justified, referring to her victims as unfortunate cases who were better off being relieved of their suffering. Eleanor Hartwell presented a dramatically different demeanor, weeping openly as the prosecution detailed her role in the murders. Her defense attorney argued that she had been manipulated and coerced by Martha, who had taken advantage of Eleanor's poverty and desperation to make her an unwilling accomplice. They keyed. His strategy might have succeeded if not for Eleanor's own ledger, which showed clear evidence of her calculating participation in planning and executing the crimes. Rebecca Sullivan, now 8 years old, provided testimony that electrified the courtroom. Her clear, simple account of what she had witnessed carried more impact than any adult testimony, and her description of Martha's expression while murdering infants left several jurors visibly shaken. Catherine Sullivan described the night when Martha and Eleanor had attempted to kill her and her daughter, her Irish accent growing thicker with emotion as she recounted fighting for their lives in the hospital basement. Thomas McKenna's testimony corroborated Catherine's account and provided additional details about Martha's final desperate attempt to justify her crimes. The defense's strategy centered on challenging the credibility of witnesses and suggesting that many of the deaths had been natural complications of childbirth rather than deliberate murder. They argued that the high mortality rate in the lying-in ward was consistent with the dangerous conditions under which poor women gave birth in the 1840s. But Dr. Whitmore's posthumous testimony, delivered through his carefully documented evidence, proved impossible to refute. His medical expertise and methodical analysis of the victim's symptoms provided irrefutable proof that the deaths were caused by deliberate poisoning and violence rather than natural complications. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from over 100 witnesses. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts of murder in the first degree. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week, and Philadelphia waited to learn whether Pennsylvania would execute its first female serial killers. What do you think would be appropriate justice for crimes of this magnitude? Judge Samuel Patterson faced the most difficult sentencing decision of his career as he prepared to pass judgment on Martha Blackwood and Eleanor Hartwell. Pennsylvania law mandated death by hanging for first-degree murder, but the idea of executing women, even women guilty of such heinous crimes, challenged social conventions that most Americans weren't ready to abandon. On April 28, 1843, the courtroom fell silent as Judge Patterson delivered his verdict. Martha Blackwood, identified as the primary architect of the murder conspiracy, was sentenced to death by hanging, her execution scheduled for June 15th. Eleanor Hartwell, whose cooperation with authorities and apparent remorse had influenced the court's decision, received life imprisonment at hard labor. The sentences sparked intense debate throughout Philadelphia and beyond. Women's rights advocates argued that the death penalty for Martha represented progress toward equal treatment under the law, while traditional voices claimed that executing a woman violated fundamental principles of Christian mercy and feminine protection. Martha maintained her composure during sentencing, showing no emotion as Judge Patterson described her crimes as an affront to civilized society and the medical profession. Her only response was a quiet statement that she had acted according to her conscience and medical judgment, a claim that horrified observers who understood the calculated nature of her murders. Eleanor collapsed upon hearing her sentence, apparently having hoped for a lighter punishment in exchange for her cooperation with investigators. Her dramatic breakdown in the courtroom provided newspaper illustrators with dramatic scenes that appeared in publications across the country, cementing the case's status as a national sensation. Dr. Edmund Hartwell's gambling debts and acceptance of suspicious donations resulted in his dismissal from Pennsylvania Hospital, though criminal charges against him were ultimately dropped due to insufficient evidence of direct knowledge of the murders. His medical career was effectively ended and he left Philadelphia in disgrace. Pennsylvania Hospital underwent significant administrative changes in response to the scandal. The lying-in ward was permanently closed, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar abuses from occurring in other departments. The hospital's reputation suffered severely, with many wealthy benefactors withdrawing their support and patients seeking care elsewhere. Rebecca and Catherine Sullivan became reluctant celebrities, their courage in exposing the murders making them symbols of justice prevailing over evil. Catherine received job offers from several institutions that wanted to employ the woman whose bravery had stopped a serial killer, while Rebecca's testimony was cited in legal journals as an example of how children's eyewitness accounts could be effectively used in criminal proceedings. The case established important precedents for medical malpractice prosecution and hospital oversight that influenced healthcare regulation for decades to come. It also demonstrated that even the most vulnerable members of society, poor women, immigrants, and children, could find justice when their voices were finally heard. But for many observers, the most troubling question remained unanswered. How many other Martha Blackwoods were operating in hospitals and clinics throughout the country? Their crimes hidden by professional respectability and social assumptions about medical benevolence. Do you believe this case could have been prevented if people had been more willing to question authority figures? Martha Blackwood walked to the gallows on June 15, 1843, becoming the first woman executed in Pennsylvania for serial murder. She maintained her composure to the end, declining to make a final statement and showing no acknowledgement of her victims' families who had gathered to witness her death. Her execution was attended by over 3,000 spectators, making it one of the largest public gatherings in Philadelphia's history. Eleanor Hartwell served 32 years in Eastern State Penitentiary before dying of consumption in 1875. Prison records indicate that she spent her final years writing detailed confessions about additional murders that she and Martha had committed, but which were never prosecuted. These documents, discovered after her death, suggested that their victim count may have exceeded 100 women and children. The Pennsylvania hospital murders became a landmark case that influenced medical regulation and criminal justice throughout the United States. New laws required multiple physician approval for certain procedures, mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths, and regular oversight of hospital charity wards. The case was studied in medical schools as an example of how professional authority could be abused without proper safeguards. Rebecca Sullivan grew up to become a nurse, dedicating her life to ensuring that patients received proper care and protection. She often spoke at medical conferences about the importance of listening to children's observations and maintaining vigilance against abuse in healthcare settings. She never married, claiming that the memories of what she had witnessed made it difficult for her to trust people in positions of authority. Catherine Sullivan used the reward money from Martha and Eleanor's capture to open a boarding house for immigrant women, providing them with safe accommodations and connections to legitimate medical care. Her establishment became a model for similar institutions throughout Pennsylvania, offering practical protection against the type of predators who had nearly claimed her and her daughter's lives. Dr. Jacob Whitmore was posthumously honored by the American Medical Association for his dedication to uncovering the truth despite personal danger. His investigative methods became standard practice for detecting medical malpractice, and his documentation techniques were taught in medical schools alongside clinical skills. The lying-in ward at Pennsylvania Hospital remained closed for 15 years before reopening under completely different administration and procedures. When it finally resumed operations in 1858, it incorporated safeguards specifically designed to prevent the type of systematic abuse that Martha and Eleanor had perpetrated. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was its demonstration that evil could flourish in the most respectable institutions when good people chose to remain silent rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The victims of Martha Blackwood and Eleanor Hartwell had been forgotten by society long before their murders, dismissed as unfortunate casualties of poverty and circumstance. Their deaths became meaningful only when a 7-year-old child found the courage to speak truth to power, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Would you have the courage to speak up if you witnessed something that seemed impossible to believe? Tell me in the comments below, because sometimes being that voice of truth is the only thing standing between evil and its next victim.